aggressive, grungy, and dirty mixes. How do we make my alternative, hardcore, grunge, indie folk band sound like the greats of the 90s? I'm sure some of you have some ideas already. Take either analog gear or analog emulations and push them beyond their limits. Push the preamps, record hot, distort the incoming signal. Overload a cassette or a reel-to-reel, overload your tape emulations. Get that sweet, warm tape compression. That would be wrong. At least according to Steve Albini. Many modern producers achieve a grungy sound by taking elements from the past or things that emulate the sounds of the past, like tape or preamps, and intentionally pushing them beyond their breaking point. This achieves a distorted, often overcompressed sound. And if you ask me, that's a cool technique, and it's also not without precedent. But if you ask Steve, that is not the way. And that exact notion is what makes him revolutionary. Here's why. If you look through Steve's discography, you're going to find a few notable names. But what astonishes me way more than that is the sheer number of underground records that Steve produced between the 1980s and his passing in 2024. Steve was a true underground producer, aiming to record and document as many underground records as possible. And the number of records on his discography has a lot to do with how he records bands.
Budget records for dead broke bands in a short amount of time, like trying to be as efficient as possible with not just with the time, but with the material. You're hitting your snare drum head so hard, we're going to have to buy a new snare drum head, So like, let me put some gaffer on there or something to keep so that we don't split the snare drum head.
But we will get to that soon. Some of his most notable records include his own bands, Shellac and Big Black, PJ Harvey, and of course, Pixies, Surfer Rosa, and Nirvana's In Utero. And for the sake of this video, those last two records are what we're going to be focusing on. The album Surfer Rosa is monumentally important for setting up the tone, the pacing, and the general music setting for the subsequent alternative rock explosion of the 90s. It's hard to understate how important the Pixies are, and I still think they don't get enough recognition today. They were the prototype that made the 90s movement happen. They were the band that walked so that Nirvana could run. And in order to fully understand that, we first need to understand the zeitgeist of the 1980s. For music, and indeed for a lot of things, the 1980s was a period of excess. In all its glory, and all of its downfalls. Artists like Duran Duran, Michael Jackson, Donna, Prince, they dominated the airwaves. And in the rock scene, you had Guns N' Roses, U2, Bon Jovi, and of course, Van Halen. The production behind a lot of these artists utilized a lot of new and emerging technologies. Things like sampling, MIDI had just hit the scene, digital synthesis and digital emulations, new reverb and delay units that were entirely digitally based. All of these new technologies made the final result highly different than what was actually being recorded. The 80s was kind of this period of hyper processing, and again, to all of its strengths and all of its detriments. I think all of us, whether we were alive during the 80s or not, do look back at this time period with kind of a nostalgic eyes. It was this peak of American exceptionalism, but also hyper consumerism, and the artistic output during this time period often reflected that. But as is typical with music, when the pendulum swings too far in one direction, it swings back with a vengeance. Whether it's the complexities of Baroque music giving way to the homophony of classical music, or punk killing the kind of high-minded complexities of the prog rock era of the late 60s and 70s, or the 90s grunge era halting the rule of 80s hair metal. When a cultural movement reaches its excessive climax, something else removes it from the throne. So where does Steve sit in all of this? Well, coming up within the bounds of the 1980s hardcore scene, Steve's approach to production was nothing like the overly processed sounds of popular music in the 80s. You'll hear this term throughout this entire video essay, but Steve's production style has been described as documentarian, choosing wherever possible to not ornament or abstract the sound of the band playing in a live setting from what you actually hear on the record. And once you understand that, you can't really unhear it in his records or how he teaches music production.
Kind of in the background all along, there was this sound that Steve Albini was getting that spoke to you guys. And so my question for you guys is, what is that sound?
I think it's the collective sound of all of those things where not one seems to be kind of in front of the other, where it's like the vocal isn't jumping ahead of everything else, or things are like riding up and down. It sounds like the sound of a group in a space. and really just natural.
Steve wants to convey the sound of a really cool band really accurately. It was this approach that made records like Surfer Rosa have the sound that it did. A lot of times this record is described as gritty or raw or real, whatever buzzword you want to use to describe a lack of overprocessing. Kurt Cobain would later directly cite the Pixies' Surfer Rosa as Nirvana's greatest inspiration. And it is because of Steve's work on Surfer Rosa that he ended up working on Nirvana's In Utero. Kurt was going for a much more raw, unpolished sound compared to Nevermind. So what are some of these techniques, and how does Steve approach a documentarian style of music production? So today I have one of New York City's coolest art rock bands coming to record. I'm going to be translating these techniques to their record, especially because they've described their preferences and their mixes to me as sounding exactly like they do live. So this fits perfectly. And we're going to be doing that with my favorite microphone company and our sponsor, Loughton Audio. If you're at all familiar with the channel, the frequency at which these microphones appear in each video tells you everything that you need to know. But today we're going to be working with their flagship Loughton Eden. As the name implies, this is kind of the holy grail. It's got 3 different circuits in one for 3 distinct voicings. It has 3 different polar patterns. It's powered by a tube, and it has a high pass filter that operates a little bit more like a saturation control than anything else. So let's get started. First, with one of the most iconic parts of an Albini mix, the drums. Take a listen to the isolated bass and drums of the Pixies' Bone Machine and tell me what you hear. When many people think of Steve Albini mixes, they think of an iconic drum sound. And I don't know about you, but whenever I think of these records, I think of a very trademark room sound. Not a big grandiose room like When the Levee Breaks, but a smaller space with a shorter decay time and a highly reflective wall sound. If we take a look at Steve's studio that he worked out of in Chicago, Electrical Audio, specifically let's take a look at the Kentucky room, we'll notice a floating wood floor. And I believe they actually have grates on the corners of these floors in order to let sound flow through the bottom of them, and brick walls for a brighter ambience and more reflectivity than you might think. Tracks in Surfer Rosa and In Utero, think of Scentless Apprentice, they're utilizing a similar sound in a similar space. It's an ambience that's much more reminiscent of a garage than it is a grandiose live room. So how do we accomplish this? Now, of course, with a career spanning 5 decades, there is going to be a bit of variation to how Steve has approached drums over the years. But I'm going to describe to you one setup that he has clearly notated in the past. It is a lot, so get ready. For the kick drum, 1 microphone, kick in. That is a Bayer Dynamic M380. Steve notes that this microphone has a greater low-end response. It's also a figure of 8 microphone. Figure of 8 microphones, when placed closer to a sound source due to the proximity effect, creates a more exaggerated low end as well. We'll get into that a little bit later in the video for a more detailed description. Then on the batter side of the kick drum, a Crown GLM 1100 lav mic. This is solely used to shape the attack of the kick drum. By placing it next to the beater, you can shape the initial transients to have a sharper attack, much in the same way that you might mic the pick or the strings on an acoustic guitar to shape the string or the pick attack. Depending on the era, Steve will then either add a synthesized sample under it or use a parallel EQ trick in order to beefen up the low end of the kick, which we will get into later in the video. Now, although not often known for using a snare bottom, when he does, he's been known to use a Shure SM98 and on top an Altec M32 microphone. On toms, he's been known to use a number of different microphones, including an AKG C451, an AKG 414, or a Josephson E22, and he will mic the top and bottom of these toms to get 2 distinct tones. Overheads are often a Coles or an STC 4038, and the position of these is over the shoulder of the drummer. He's quoted as saying that this position reflects the sound that the drummers hear more accurately than directly overhead. Again, what the musicians hear is what's being recorded. Although he typically avoids recording a hi-hat at all costs, if he does record a hi-hat, he uses a Bayer Dynamic M160. Darker tone of this microphone makes it a bit less shrill. Now, in addition to this, Steve uses several different pairs of ambient microphones. Steve uses a Neumann SM2, which is a stereo microphone placed in front of the kit in a Blumline fashion. Blumline is essentially a stereo X pattern made with 2 different figure 8 microphones. As you'll see in my example, if you don't have a stereo microphone, you can use 2 different figure 8 microphones placed 90 degrees off axis from each other to make an X pattern. Then he matches this with a few different pairs of Omni room microphones. He's been known to use Neumann CMV 563s about 10 feet away and another pair 30 feet away in a separate room sometimes. He has in the past been known to even use a microphone placed on the floor. The idea being you get more ambience without necessarily too many room reflections coming off of the wall. Now, I know my audience, and I know that listing out all of this gear makes us all very happy, but the position of these microphones, the voicing of these microphones, I would say that these are much more important than the exact microphone selection. After all, a lot of these microphones are going to be extremely expensive. So if you're looking to emulate this sound, take a look at these microphones' frequency responses and find a microphone in your locker that has a similar kind of vibe to it. The reason the positions are important, these positions give you multiple different options, multiple different voicings for each part of the drum kit. What we've effectively done is create a snapshot at different positions of the drum, different tonalities that we can choose to prioritize or deprioritize depending on the type of drum sound we're after. The beater mic is the brighter attack of the kick. The kick in is the low end, it's the heft. The floor tom with the top and bottom microphones. The Coles 4038s as overheads versus the Blum line that's right in front of the kit. It's so important to have these microphones because Steve doesn't like to use EQ. When researching this video, Steve, on multiple different occasions, referred to an EQ as destructive.
In addition to the microphone channels, there's an electronic channel. I often synthesize a separate, very, very narrow band and have that as a separate fader on the desk so that I can add low frequency energy without causing all the destructive artifacts of an equalizer on the original channel.
By choosing different tonalities and different areas of each element of the drum set, the fader balance of each microphone becomes your EQ without ever touching an EQ. The balance of direct microphones versus the ambient microphones, or the balance of Blum line versus overheads, or the balance of the entire drum kit versus the room microphones. Your job is to make the drums hit the emotional beats that you want them to purely through fader level. And that all falls apart if we don't understand this concept of phase. This is a sine wave. It sounds like this. And this is that same sine wave flipped upside down. Sounds the same, except technically, that one that was flipped arrived to your ears a fraction of a millisecond later than the original. When played individually, the difference is indiscernible. But when played on top of each other, let's see what we hear. Perfect mirror of a sine wave exactly cancels out the original, meaning we don't hear anything at all. So what if we apply this same principle to a much more nuanced, complex sound like a drum kit? In this example, two different microphones are placed at two different positions relative to the drum kit. They're recording the exact same sound, but variations in their frequency response, meaning the variations in how the microphone is tuned, whether they're picking up more treble or more bass, for example. And more importantly, the variations in their distance will mean that the two different microphones will have two different variations in sound waves, even though they're recording the exact same source. And because they're placed in two different positions, there will be a fraction of a millisecond difference between the time it takes for the drum kit to arrive to the closer microphone compared to the farther microphone. If we zoom in really closely into the DAW, we can see that at the foundational level, both microphones recording the same source have resulted in two different waveforms where the crests and the troughs are misaligned, thus partially cannibalizing our signal. That sounds like this. But if we just scoot this waveform back a little bit, now it sounds like this. This is what everyone is referring to whenever they're referring to phase, phase cancellation, checking your phase, whatever it happens to be. Hell, even a phaser is just a guitar pedal that plays with the same acoustic phenomenon. As we hear in our example, generally something that is out of phase is going to lack low end. That's because lower frequencies have much less frequent oscillations, making them easier to kind of cancel out and be discernible by our ears. Now you can check this fairly easily. Just record the source material, check in your DAW to see if the waveforms are misaligned, and then slightly adjust the microphone until that's no longer happening. True and complete phase alignment doesn't really exist, but we can make it as in phase as possible. Steve used an oscilloscope because he worked in the analog world. This is our digital solution to the same problem. Now, why are we bringing all of this up in the drum section? Well, if we're going to work with as little EQ as possible, and as you'll learn later, as little compression as possible too, and we're going to be working with this many different microphones on the same drum kit, this whole concept falls apart if all the harmonic information starts to eat itself. And the way that we get the most honest, realistic, documentarian method of recording the drum kit is not only through microphone placement and fader level, but also making sure that all these sounds are accurate in their phase. Cannot emphasize enough how much Steve talks about phase relationships. You can't commit to the recording and work very little in post-processing if at the source your sound is completely destroyed through a lack of phase coherency. Now, for the sake of this production, we're going to be using all the same positions that we've outlined already in this video, but I'm going to add a kick out as well as a kick in. We'll be using the Lauten kick mic for kick in, and the Lauten Clarion is just beautiful as a kick out. So we'll be using that. And in addition to that, we'll be using a Sennheiser 421 compact in order to get the beater sound on the front of the kick. I used the Lauten snare mic on snare top, Shure SM57 on snare bottom, Lauten tom mics for both the toms, and a Sennheiser Mark IV on floor tom bottom. Then, because my studio has a serious lack of ribbon microphones, we used Austrian Audio OC-A18 set to their figure 8 pattern and placed those over the drummer's shoulder. And for the Blum line, since I didn't have a matching pair of figure 8 microphones, I used the Lauten Eden in combination with an Austrian Audio OC-S10 for figure 8s. You can see that my lack of microphone options compared to electrical audio, for example, is a little bit more patchwork, but I think we still got a great drum sound at the end of the day. Finally, 2 Lauten LA120s with their Omni capsules on, placed farther back in the room to get the room tone. Now, this is not electrical audio. In fact, it is much less reflective, but it's still a pretty good room sound. You can hear it here. With all the phase checked and everything ready to roll, this was our final unmixed raw drum sound. Now, Steve often did not operate with the DI signal for bass, choosing instead to pair 2 different microphones, both of them in charge of different harmonic registers. One of them, a Sennheiser 421, was more for the bright top end placed at the center of the speaker cone, and the other one was a Beyerdynamic M380, which is more in charge of the low end. Now, we don't have a bass amp in the studio, so I made do with what I had. Took a DI signal and duplicated it in Ableton, then ran it through the same amp sim 2 times, taking the virtual microphone and positioning it one to bias low end and one to bias top end, and then balancing the digital faders to try and emulate this technique. I think the bass tone still sounded pretty killer. Here it is alone, and then with the raw drums. Now, particularly through Steve's recording of electric guitars, you'll notice his commitment to realism, this kind of documentarian approach that we keep hammering home. The way Steve records guitars, he has much less of an exaggerated proximity effect than a lot of other producers. Proximity effect meaning the closer you get to a signal, the more low end that you produce. In Steve's eyes, this is not necessarily what the amp sounds like in the room or to your ears. Traditional wisdom would tell you to place 2 different microphones, often an SM57 paired with a condenser, somewhere along the speaker. The closer you get to the center of the cone, the more treble you're gonna get. The farther away, the less treble you're gonna get. But typically, many people place them right up on top of the grill. Steve would argue that this is a hang-up from live shows where isolation is really necessary. And in fact, placing the microphone at the center of the cone, but then placing it a few feet back, or if you have a cabinet with multiple speakers at the nexus of these speakers, will create a less exaggerated proximity effect and a more realistic sound to what you hear in the room. And even in settings where you're recording the guitars with the drum kit and other instruments around it, you might be surprised at how little bleed you get with a loud enough guitar signal. Steve has been known to use a ribbon paired with a brighter condenser microphone for this setup. This gives you the option to balance the faders as an EQ or split the microphones as a stereo sound. Now I want to stop here to hammer a point home. If you've seen my video on the production methodologies of the Beatles' Revolver and Jeff Emmerich, if you haven't, you should definitely watch it. You'll notice that nearly everything that made that album revolutionary flies in the face of everything that we're teaching here today. Steve would never use the methods that Jeff Emmerich used, yet both of them, in their given cultural context, were revolutionary. Jeff Emmerich purposely distorted microphone preamps. He pushed and saturated tape, used a ton of compression, and created this trademark distorted hugeness of the Beatles' Revolver. As we'll learn later, Steve never oversaturated tape, never clipped microphone preamps, recorded elements as accurately as possible without exaggerating their proximity effect with the microphones, and tried his best to avoid overcompression. Yet both of them, during their given moments, completely changed the cultural paradigm. For Jeff and the Beatles, abstracting the production process paved the way for the Beatles to make records like Sgt. Pepper's. They completely gave themselves to this notion that we can create records that could never be recorded if we just recorded organic sounds. Their use of sampling, their experimentation with synthesizers, reversing tape, all of this is production trickery, and it's what made these records iconic. And for Steve, his documentarian approach allowed alternative and hardcore bands during the 80s and 90s to have a much more blisteringly honest and raw sound than the stuff coming out of the 80s right before that, thus marking the shift in production in the 80s from an over-processed sound to a less processed sound in the 90s. And we know what happened next. After the Pixies, there was grunge with Nirvana, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, the alternative music explosion of the 2000s with the Strokes and the White Stripes. A lot of this stuff we're still feeling the ripple effects from today. And that, my friends, is why neither Steve nor Jeff is right. Anyone who provides an absolute truth or empirically correct way of recording audio, at least whenever it comes to record production, is flying in the face of someone legendary that came before them, who they themselves flew in the face of somebody who came before them. There are only methods of thinking that you will either agree with or that you won't. It's up to you to take what you do and don't like from each era, each producer, each record, and then retranslate into a patchwork of different techniques that you call your own. That is how you define the next meta. That's how you define your meta. Anyways, after some experimenting, I ended up using the gentle voicing on the Loudon Eden paired with my favorite budget condenser, the LA220. That's kind of a darker voicing, which is kind of subbing in for the lack of ribbon microphones in my studio, about 1.5 feet away to not exaggerate the proximity effect too much. Let's hear these raw and then with the bass and the drums. What's going on, guys? I am deep into editing this video, and I just wanted to remind you that the sister video where I go over all the mix breakdown, all the plugins I use, and how I process the unmixed signal, that's over on Patreon. $5 a month gets you access to every single mix breakdown for every single production on this channel. All of these and all of the ones coming in the future. And as always, remember the unmixed tracks are available for you to download in the description down below so you can practice yourself. If it wasn't super obvious, these videos take a ton of time, and the best way that you can possibly help in this complex, terrifying algorithm is to just subscribe and like the video. So if you learned something new, it would really mean a lot. And let's get back to it. Now quickly, even though I don't have any information on how Steve would have done this, we did have a full horn section and an electric violin in this song. I had a direct microphone on each one of the horns and a stereo room setup about 8 or 9 feet away from them. The ultimate goal of this record is to use the sound of the room through the drum kit and through the horns to be the primarily or only reverb sound that we get in the space. Here's a diagram of how I plotted this out while embracing all the bleed from the different instruments, so I kind of had a cohesive stereo image of the horns rather than each individual horn. The violin was an electric, so it was just a DI going into the interface. Let's hear that in isolation and then with the rest of the instrumentation. And the vocals were just the Loudon Eden. I put it on the gentle setting, and then Pagona, the vocalist, did 1/10 take, which is insane when you hear this vocal. It's crazy that this is all just one take. Steve was known to use tube condensers, so this ended up working out, especially because with 3 different voicings, we were able to find the one that worked perfectly, which again was the gentle setting. Let's hear how this adds to all of the raw tracks.
I broke a fever in New Orleans. We drank a fifth of whiskey and steam. I thought we had a good deal, don't just say, but you made the history a banality.
Do you remember way back at the beginning of the video when I said this? Push the preamps, record hot, distort the incoming signal. That would be wrong. Here's where that starts to come in. Many of the techniques that we use to get aggressive tones today involve purposely pushing gear or purposely pushing emulators beyond their intended limit. Well, Steve would disagree with that. When it comes to post-production and mixing, Steve's hand is very light, and he always works within the designated bounds of the gear that he's using. Now, Steve is very well known for sticking to the analog world well into the digital age, always recording onto tape and always using a console. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he's using it for the analog sound. Now, every interview and every course that I watched to research for this video, Steve affirmed that he was using tape for its permanence, for its file management potential, rather than relying on an ever-changing landscape of digital technology that seems to change every 5 to 10 years. As long as the master tapes are stored properly, that medium is going to last for centuries rather than decades.
In a lot of digital sessions, there is no final master tape. There's just like a series of edits and manipulations that has stopped at a certain point, right? And that's where the session is. If you lose all of that because none of the edits or the edit decision list doesn't survive, or because the software that you were using is, that company went out of business, and computer technology uses different storage media or whatever. If you lose that, you can't just resurrect the original source material, because the original source material is essentially meaningless.
Steve chose to stick to tape for the sake of a physical archive. And as an extension of that, he rarely used tape improperly, choosing to stick within the headroom of the tape itself. And Steve is also not a big fan of overly compressing a mix. He's not known for using a stereo compressor on the mix bus, meaning he doesn't compress the entire mix signal, and pushing tape beyond its headroom not only distorted the signal, but it also compressed it. In other words, it didn't sound like what the band sounded like live. In fact, Steve often only abstracted the mix from what was recorded on request from the band. And one other thing that I thought was really cool about his process, Steve always mixed the songs with the band in the room. This gave him immediate feedback and made sure that he didn't push the mix into a landscape that the band didn't want. So keeping all of this in mind, I tried to emulate this as best as possible in the digital world. We mixed with members of the band in the room, and honestly, you might be surprised about the feedback that I got. Rather than asking for a lot of the things that we might reach for, like a compressor, an EQ, distortion, delay, reverb, whatever it happens to be, the band almost entirely spoke in terms of volume balancing.
I like a little bit of verb, but I don't like that much processing on my vocals.
I don't know if they should just be at a slightly lower level overall, but it might sound better to have them come in loud and then put them down slightly for the horn. That first violin note is still a little too loud. I think it was a little too quiet.
By setting up enough microphones on each source, recording those sources accurately, sticking to the sound of the band live, and having the option to adjust EQ balances simply through fader motions, 80% of this mix ended up just being volume automation. We went through section by section, balancing each instrument, balancing the snare, balancing the kick, balancing the levels of different stereo guitars by just adjusting that volume fader line. Now, Steve worked through a manual fader, writing it on the console, but this was very close to his process. And it also explains a lot about his speed and his prolific discography. The basic mix only took a few hours rather than days and days like us audio engineers are more used to. 80% of this mix was just Shep's Omnichannel. This has everything that you could possibly need to get a mix done, including multiple different voicings for compression, EQ, preamp emulations, de-essers, you name it. Beyond that, there were some small effects like a short reverb tail on the vocal, chorus, delay, and some vocal distortion that was requested for the outro. Now, beyond these principles, there are very few tricks when it comes to getting the Steve Albini mix. So much of this is just microphone and source material, but there are a few. Steve used a few mixing tricks in order to get an even sound out of the drum kit, namely on the kick and on the overheads. If he's not using a sample, Steve will send the kick drum to a parallel EQ, boosting a resonant frequency close to the fundamental. On a parametric EQ, it might look something like this. This signal is left live monitored until finally printed, so if you send too much signal, you might get a feedback loop. You can check out how that sounds here. Steve also used a peak limiter on the overheads. This is primarily just to make sure the snare isn't overpowering the cymbals. Here's an example of how that sounds. Then, if he doesn't feel like the room mics are getting enough of the room sound, he will use a stereo delay, typically anywhere from 12 milliseconds to 24 milliseconds. This is at 100% wet, thus artificially increasing the distance of the stereo room microphones relative to the drum kit. That sounds like this. I'm probably repeating myself a lot, but beyond this, the bass, the guitar, and the vocals, it really is just minor EQ and a minor amount of compression. And that's roughly all I did as well. Why don't I play the groups mixed and unmixed, and if there's any significant plugins showing up, I'll put them on the screen as well. And I'll also make sure to solo the room sounds for the instruments that had room microphones. And that is a glimpse into the production process of Steve Albini. It's also a glimpse into one of the greatest examples of foundational recording techniques. This method of recording not only shaped the 90s rock scene and all the alternative rock to follow, but it is a great baseline to know and understand before you start getting crazy in the digital world. We live in a post-production world, one ruled by the DAW and absolute plug-in pandemonium, and a lot of really cool sounds that you can get out of the computer. I don't mean to diss that in any way, but if you can learn all these principles and execute them well, everything that you do in post-production, everything you do in the digital world only is going to sound better because your source material didn't need post-production in the first place. And that is the beauty of Steve Albini. And with that, thank you so much to Loughton Audio for sponsoring. You can check out Partygirl here on Instagram, and this is their newest single, New Orleans.
not so clean, the drinks so cheap, yeah, sugar and cream. It's great that I can't live normally, 'cause I think you should marry, I think happily. I think I always say exactly what I mean, 'cause I think you should marry. In New Orleans, we drank a fifth of whiskey and steam. I thought we had a good deal, don't you say? But you made the history reality. It's great, you're two-faced, one shaven, bright and clean. Your other, it capsized with flooding blood and grain. It's great that I can't live normally, 'cause I think you should marry, I think happily. I think I always say exactly what I mean, 'cause I think you should marry.
I don't think you need to do another take of that shit. At least,
The part where you go, ah!
Dude, he just played you scream. It was just you screaming.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
Holy fuck. No, that was awesome.
I was checking to make sure it didn't click.
All right, guys. I'm sick. This has been an intense script to try and get through. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.